What's been important for me about that work has been the opportunity to really stylistically and in storytelling look at the real stories and influences on the rawness of our human intimacies. What that really works to challenge is something that, sex workers tend to call the hierarchy. This idea that some sex workers are better than others, or that some forms of sex work are actual work and other forms of sex work are slavery, trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. And the illusion that kind of falls under is that any of us would work if we did not have to. So people who sex work to survive, their work is just as legitimate as people who sex work to save money for an overseas trip, or people who sex work as a career.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. Today on The Erotic Philosopher, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Gala Vanting. Gala is a writer, a sex worker, and an advocate living and working as a migrant settler on Gadigal land, also known as Sydney, Australia. Her work is woven through the brothel, the boardroom, screen, stage and page, public health and sex education. She aims to create compassionate and justice-driven dialogue about gender and power, sexuality, technology, media and culture, and is an advocate for the human rights of sex workers. In today's conversation, Gala schools us about the importance of understanding legislation on the lives and well-being and human rights of sex workers, as well as paints a picture of a utopian queer erotic future for all of us. Enjoy this conversation with Gala Vanting. Gala Vanting, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. I'm really glad we could carve out some time to make this happen. The time zone differences between us can make it challenging, so I appreciate you having your breakfast while I'm having my dinner here together.
Pleasure. Very nice to be chatting to you in a professional context again.
In a professional context. So for folks listening who may not be familiar with Gala Vanting's work, Gala Vanting has been one of my dearest friends for a very long time. I think getting on to about 10 years now. And we spent a lot of time together as friends and as collaborators when I was still living in Australia. And Gala's work is just some of the most remarkable that we're going to be talking about today, because her work really spans so many aspects of sex, sexuality, sex work, and art that are really unique intersections that I've never met anybody else do before. And so that's really why I wanted to have you on the show, because your insight into how these things work together and the conviction with which you have always demonstrated your work has never ceased to impress me. So my understanding is currently you're doing a bunch of things, one of which is some involvement with the Scarlet Alliance. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm the National Programs Manager at Scarlet Alliance, which is the Australian Sex Workers Association, and that's the national peak body for sex workers and sex worker organizations in Australia, so primarily an advocacy organization.
What's the role of the Scarlet Alliance in general for people who may be listening from other parts of the world, or even people listening from Australia who may not be familiar with what the Scarlet Alliance does?
So Scarlet Alliance is a sort of, so we're a national advocacy body, and that means that we represent sex workers from across Australia, and we do that at a federal level, so advocacy, policy making, law reform, and then it kind of comes down to the state and territory and even local levels, dealing with things like councils.
How is the role of Scarlet Alliance placed in connection with, bettering the situation for sex workers, certainly in Australia, and then looking at it through the lens of the US and even the UK too? What is it that the Scarlet Alliance provides that allows for a facilitated discussion around sex worker rights at all of those levels that you just talked about?
So what Scarlet Alliance does is, we really represent the voice or voices of sex workers getting seats at the table for law reform processes, among other things. And so what that means is that, and because we're a peer-based organization, everybody involved with Scarlet Alliance is a sex worker, and we're able to have super broad contact with sex workers through our member organizations, which means we get a lot of information about the kinds of laws that sex workers actually want. So the lived experience, the impact of bad policy and bad legislation on sex workers. And so, a lot of what we're doing is supporting our member organizations to advocate for things like the full decriminalization of sex work, anti-discrimination and anti-vilification protections for sex workers, and all of the things that constitute systemic stigma against sex workers. And in the United States, as in Australia, there is some room in state legislation for changes around sex work. And, we have the same thing. So we regulate by a state and territory, at a state and territory level. There is no sort of federal sex work legislation. And, so I can see that there are definitely some parallel types of campaigns, and there have always been similar organizations running in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And that's part of a pretty global movement for the full decriminalization of sex work, which means that all forms of sex work are decriminalized, meaning there is no criminal code that covers those things. And we instead rely on existing legislation like taxation, migration law, labor law, all of the things that regulate work. And we rely on those things to regulate sex work because we're positioning sex work as work.
And within that model, how, for people listening who may have heard a little bit about the sex worker rights movement, who maybe know sex workers and ultimately believe that sex work and sex workers should be protected, but not really understanding the distinction, for example, between decriminalization and legalization. Could you speak to how that works across the board, and what it means to sex workers, to the lives and the well-being of sex workers?
Sure. The full decriminalization of sex work means that all sex workers are able to live free of criminalization, of being criminals, of having their bodies criminalized, their workplaces criminalized, their clients criminalized. And often criminalization can actually take the form of criminalizing all the things that surround a sex work exchange, like our advertising or, the hotel that we work from or something like that. And legalization often has some of those features. So legalization is kind of a blanket term for a lot of different manifestations of a two-tiered system where some sex work is legal and other types of sex work are not legal, or where the sex work itself is legal but the client is criminalized, which is effectively for, as far as sex workers are concerned, that is effectively criminalizing us. You can't criminalize our clients or our workplaces and not also, criminalize us by de facto. And so, the reason why sex workers are campaigning so hard for the full decriminalization of sex work is because quite often in legalized models, the sex workers who get left behind in those models are street-based sex workers, migrant sex workers, sex workers of color, trans sex workers. And so I think, one of the important features of the movement for decriminalization, for the full decriminalization of sex work, is that it is really about every single sex worker. And we as a movement are not actually willing to hand over some, quote unquote collateral damage in the form of criminalizing street-based sex workers, for example. And there's often a respectability politics that plays out in those dialogues with lawmakers, and that's something that movement really resists.
And that's really where the stigma element comes into it, because there's something about, a university student or, a college student working in a strip club that somehow these days becomes sort of normalized, and that's kind of considered okay, even cool. But if you're doing full service work on the street, it's still considered, one of the most grotesque things that a person can do, particularly a woman could do. And that stigma, when we talk about it through the lens of full decriminalization, it includes people who do street-based work, people who work in strip clubs, and people who do escorts to high-flying corporate executives. Everyone's all in the same bag.
Exactly. And what that really works to challenge is something that, sex workers tend to call the hierarchy. This idea that some sex workers are better than others, or that some forms of sex work are actual work and other forms of sex work are slavery, trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. And the illusion that kind of falls under is that any of us would work if we did not have to. So people who sex work to survive, their work is just as legitimate as people who sex work to save money for an overseas trip, or people who sex work as a career. So I think there's a equity and the equanimity that the full decriminalization of sex work enables really challenges that hierarchy. But that's very uncomfortable for most people because, unless you, I would imagine that probably 10 to 20% of your listeners might have ever heard the term hierarchy. So we're not necessarily all thinking about it. And that makes it hard to talk about when we are actually, sitting in politicians' chambers discussing law reform measures.
And I think that's a really important thing, because even though certain aspects of sex work have become somewhat more visible, say in the last 5 or 10 years, and I guess I'm thinking more about strippers and lap dancers and that sort of thing, which it's considered okay, I guess, to do that sort of work these days rather than back in the old days when it was still considered to be super grotesque. And now, increasingly folks doing independent work, doing camming, making their own porn and making their own movies and that sort of stuff, which will go into your relationship with that work also. But that it's, for people listening to recognize that sex work is actually, when you hear people talking about sex work, they're really talking about a broad range of skills. It's not, what we would call full service sex work, which is, traditional kind of penis in vagina style sex, where the sex worker is female and the client is male. That's one aspect of it, but there's so many ways that sex work happens these days, and a lot of it happening online now.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that the destigmatization of sex work has to offer to us is the recognition of that very diverse skill set that sex workers hold. And, I want to live in a world where I can put my sex work career in all of its diversity on my CV, because actually the skills that I built there have been incredibly useful and are definitely transferable. And there's lots of very high level, project management work and, human relations and,
community outreach,
education,
health, peer education, there's so many things. And, like we were saying earlier, the one thing that still really derails so many conversations about sex work is of course, it's never sex workers. It's the discomfort that people feel around even the notion of sex work, that people feel like they don't know what to say, they don't know how to handle it, and more progressive people who may say, well, yeah, I am pro-sex work, but I've never done it myself. So for people listening who perhaps are, therapists or in helping professions of some kind, which I know there's a lot of folks who are in that field listening to this podcast, and also people who just have an interest in sex, who maybe are friends with sex workers or dating sex workers even, or meeting people on Tinder and whichever apps, who maybe have disclosed that they're a sex worker and you're considering starting up a relationship with them. So, Gala, what are some of the things that you wish civilians understood about sex work and sex workers in order to be better therapists, better friends, better partners, better people to sex workers?
The first thing that I would have to recommend is to Google, or actually do a YouTube search for "Every Hoe I Know Says So." which is a fantastic collection. It's a little video that collects the voices of a whole bunch of sex workers who are talking about what they do want civilians to know about their work and their lives.
Every hoe, H-O, not H-O-E?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. And look, it definitely came out at a time when we weren't quite talking about the appropriation of African American vernacular English, and the term hoe, it does have some contention around it now. Sex workers want to be treated as every other human. But I think they also want to have relationships with people who really take on the impact of stigma, who really work to understand how that plays out in our everyday lives. And that's very difficult to do without lived experience. And so it's really important to seek out information about the lived experience of sex workers, but also to not make the sex worker who you know or who you are seeing as a client or who you are seeing as a romantic partner or dating or whatever, not to have them be your sole source of information about sex work. You know, we don't want to spend that time doing that education in our personal lives, and we also shouldn't have to. And I think that there is a sort of responsibility that you take on if you say, okay, well, I'm going to offer a counseling or a therapy or body work service to sex workers, you know, to do that self-education. And I know that there are lots of marginalized communities who are calling for that right now, and sex workers are some of them. I think it's also, you know, being able to separate the work that we do from who we are, you know, like, and for some of us, like, sex work is an important identity, but it is not our only identity. And I think there's this general, you know, like, the way that we're understood in the popular consciousness is that we are always already sex working. You know, there is never a time when we are not first and foremost sex workers. And so I think to
and always profoundly horny.
Yes, which I can certainly attest to is not true. And I
you heard it here first, folks.
I think there's a desire to there's like a sort of voyeurism that can come in those spaces as well, where you know, sex workers often hear, your job must be so interesting, tell me all about it. I feel entitled to ask you a whole bunch of questions about your job that I wouldn't be comfortable with you asking me about mine. You know, so those kinds of things I think are a great way to get a sex worker offside, or to make sure that they feel no inclination to be intimate with you, or to share their vulnerability with you.
And I think, I mean, as you say, that's the crucial thing, that so many different groups now are asking people to do their own research about how to be an ally, how to support, how to be best informed, and about communities that you're interacting with that may not be communities that you are necessarily part of, but just through circumstance you end up being orbiting around different communities, which is good. We want that to happen. And, you know, the crucial thing is not to obviously burden the person who's the target of the inquiry to be the one who provides you with all that information, that we have the internet now.
And also you have so many spaces where sex workers are actually telling their own stories and representing themselves. And, you know, look, I will say this, they are getting swallowed by big tech. They are, you know, sex workers are being deplatformed left, right, and center. So I understand that, you know, that because we are often shadow banned, or have our accounts taken away from us, or have to censor what we say so that we can retain our intellectual property, you know, those stories are getting harder to find easily. But also, at the same time, there is such a volume of them that there's kind of no excuse.
Gala, I want to talk to you also, I mean, because, you know, the sex work and the politics of sex work is certainly something that you're passionate about. And in the time that I've known you, you have, you know, been a strong advocate for sexuality across the board. And in previous incarnations that I've known you in is more through an artistic lens, but always with a community vision at heart. So let's talk a little bit about, going back perhaps to, 10 years ago or so when I met you, when you were doing a lot more film work, both in front of and behind the camera. What are you still working in that field? And then how is that sort of folding into the other creative projects you've got going now outside of your advocacy work?
I've always tried to link art and intimacy in the work that I do. And I've done that through film. I've done that through sex education and a little bit of kind of public performance, or I now do that through a space that I run, a physical space. And I think what's been important for me about that work has been the opportunity to really kind of stylistically and in storytelling, look at the real stories and influences on the rawness of our human intimacies. And I think there's when I started making erotic film, that was in response to a lack of that kind of representation in mainstream porn. And that has changed a lot since I started working in that space.
Yeah,
and there is now
really
a great deal of very well done and very diverse porn, smut, erotica, whatever, that's all out there. But at the time I was doing it, I hadn't seen a lot of what I was making. And I think there was a really solid response to that work, simply because it had this rawness and it sort of steered away from predictable narratives and outcomes that we would see in porn and towards things that really revealed the relationships between people and their own vulnerabilities and tried to also really sink in aesthetically to what it might be like to be that body who's in that scene at that time. That work wound up maybe 5 years ago, simply because it was like throwing money into an incinerator. So it was just very, very difficult to resource. And also, it's difficult to sell the kind of content that we made because a lot of it was censored by the major porn billing companies. So
like the big tube sites and stuff, you mean? Or
no, so the billers that actually provide a billing service for...
Oh, I see, like the PayPals and the Stripes and those kind of...
Yeah, so there's a couple of adult billing companies that handle a lot of the billing for porn companies, but they censor content in order to use their service. There are certain things that you cannot show in your photos or your videos, and those were things that, so it's kind of like
I did not know that.
Yeah, so they sort of police. Which is really interesting to have a biller policing what is not seen. Yeah, but that's sexual capitalism. It's a
far out. I had no idea about that.
Yeah, so that really made it hard for us to distribute, but we also, we really produced production outfit that I was a part of was called Sensei Films. It was a duo between myself and a friend and collaborator, Avon Frey. And our whole thing was what we called slow porn. And that meant that we really focused on the quality and the process of the product rather than producing at volume. So, that also, I guess, made it was a model that wasn't necessarily ever going to be lucrative. And, we both went into other spaces and I also moved into full-time sex work, and so that didn't leave me a lot of time to pursue that kind of stuff. But, the things that informed that practice still really are with me, and I've kind of taken that into some other aspects of my work since then.
And so your current project now is Hedonism. Tell us about what it is and I mean, really, what's the ethos behind it? Like, what's the, your vision for it? Because, again, it's a really unique project. This is your version of where community meets art, meets sex, meets kink.
Yeah, you're right. Just like with Sensei Films, I don't see anything else like Head and House existing. And I think that's often, I'm always looking to create the thing that I can't see already. So Hedon House is a physical space. It's a house, and the space is basically just set up for hedonism, and the space started out as my workplace. So I set up a full kind of studio for BDSM sessions, but it's also an incredibly nurturing space in many other facets. So it has, a beautiful garden with fruit trees and herbs and outdoor bathing. And it has, these very big, beautiful, loungy spaces, lots of things that just help you feel, and things that help you be in your body. And the aesthetic of the space is really a departure from the traditional, red and black leather BDSM, mainstream aesthetic. And that was important to me because I wanted people to be able to enter the space with curiosity about kink, but not necessarily experience, and feel like it was accessible to them. And that's something that I think is often missing from commercial dungeons, and in Australia there aren't very many commercial dungeons, and they tend to come and go pretty quickly. So in order to hire those kinds of spaces in Australia, you're usually actually going to a licensed brothel that is set up as a BDSM house, which means that there are lots of other people around you. There's sex work happening in the next room, and so for some people that's a lot. And so I created this space so that people could come and explore whatever it was that they wanted to explore, whether it was kink, vanilla, or just like having their partner give them a massage in a beautiful space and having an outdoor bath afterwards. So the space is really, when I talk about it, I say that it was queerly conceived, and by that I mean it's a space that that has a queer politic and aesthetic built into it. And I think for people who identify with queerness, or people from the LGBTIQ plus community, it feels like it was really made for you. And that was something that I thought was really important. A lot of sort of commercial dungeon spaces can feel either very heterosexual or very gay male, and this space feels like neither. And this is not to say that it doesn't feel comfy and welcoming to people who are not from those communities, but it was really made with my queer community in mind and at heart. So the space is available for rent by the hour or by the evening. And you can sort of construct whatever experience it is that you want to have. So, it works as a solo experience. It works for couples. I've definitely had like a few friends hire it together and play together, or just have a little gathering. People come from different parts of the country and they meet there. So it's really, it's almost hard for me to describe in words because it's so many things. And all of them are really focused around grounding, landing, being held, being nurtured, and the house is very much a container. And as a professional BDSM practitioner, making containers is what I'm skilled at, and making them sort of customized to what the experience that needs to be had and the person having it. So I feel like it really has melded my skills really beautifully, and my aesthetic, as well.
And it just sounds, like an important space to be able to have access to. And I certainly know, from living in Australia, how rare those kinds of places are, to where you can be in a place that is not pre-designed with its own story already embedded in it, that you can make your own story based on the location, based on the aesthetics, based on the equipment, and also, the people who you bring with you on the journey, that it's open to whatever you want to make and the way that you want to make it, which I think is so crucial for people's explorations around, sex and the erotic, whether the focus is pleasure or whether the focus is healing or whether the focus is knowledge, or, any of the myriad of reasons that people do sexy things in different corners of the world.
And I think that, it's also about the community that you're connected to when you're doing those things, when you're making those explorations. And I really wanted Head and House to be an asset to my community. And, in order to do that, I have to create lots of different access points to the space. And one of the things that has come along recently is something called the Big Reveal Bathhouse, which is basically, a daytime bathing ritual experience that's held by myself and a friend, where, we offer a sliding scale, we make it queer and trans only, and we try to offer things that are accessible to the people in our community who don't necessarily have the income to book a whole night, for example. So it's also for me about being able to let people experience the space from a variety of access points. And I'm always evolving that piece of it as I come to offer new things or find new uses for the space. And sometimes that's really about somebody else coming in and saying, hey, have you thought about doing this? So there's a lot of collaboration, I think, also that makes the space what it is. And my partner has done a whole lot of the aesthetic and sort of infrastructural work. So, it's also got like all of the, the leather work was done by a local dyke leather worker who's been around for 30-40 years. So I also try to bring in these elements of our local community and also pay homage to all of the crafty dykes who made the BDSM scene what it was in the 90s and the early 2000s. So it's really nice to sort of tie those histories together.
So one of the things that I have always loved about you, apart from the fact that you're just fabulous, is your ability to weave together so many what seem like disparate parts of human lives, like you've done with Head and House, and even weaving in the historical element of the dykes who once were part of the leather scene, that even their imprint is there through the furniture, literally as part of the furniture, and how now in more contemporary times sex workers' stories are being eliminated, that accounts are getting shadow banned, they're being shut down, they're being blacklisted for various other things, and yet their stories, historical stories, contemporary stories, and future generational stories are so incredibly important, not only to the movement but to understanding the role of sexuality and its evolution, and how it informs how we see ourselves and how we support other humans at a humanitarian level, at a community level. And so your work around sex workers and storytelling in a variety of spaces, in person and digital spaces, is evolving. Talk to us about how that is going, how it works, and what you're doing.
So, I guess the place where I get to do that most often is in things like hosting panels, and trying to bring sex worker voices into spaces like the literary space, for example, that they aren't always. But I think that's for me that's also about exposing myself to the sort of the emergence of this sex worker storytelling culture. I feel like there have been a lot more television shows and podcasts and that sort of thing that are emerging of late, where sex workers are actually speaking for themselves, or they're telling their own stories, or they're advising the telling of sex worker stories in a meaningful way. And I think that's something that even as we lose access to these to Zuckerberg's platforms, we are actually still able to raise the profile of stories that come directly from our mouths. And there has been quite a bit of that in the United States. There's been so much movement around gathering sex worker stories, for about 20 years, and probably that's my age showing. It's probably been longer than that. I've just only been conscious of it for 20 years. But in Australia, that's really just starting to emerge, and we're starting to see sex workers being published. And my very dear friend Queenie Bonbon has a regular storytelling event now that they're also podcasting. So we're really. It's called Glory Hole, and if you find Queenie on Instagram, for as long as Queenie can stay on Instagram, you can find some links to the podcasts. So those things, they're being collected about 3 times a year, maybe 4, and Glory Hole. But there's plenty more where that came from, and they're happening in all across the world, really. But the United States, I've noticed, has really taken off with that, and seeing Netflix shows with realistic sex worker characters, and we're not completely realistic, but we're getting there. And I think what that really tells us is that when you have a sex worker involved in the telling of a sex work story, you are inevitably going to get a better product, a more realistic and in-depth character, and so I think the space is finally starting to open up, but I do note that only certain sex workers are allowed to tell their own stories. We're definitely still in a space where marginalized sex workers' stories get stolen from them on a regular basis to make a point. But white sex workers or dominatrices or high-class call girls, or those stories are the ones that are selling at the moment. So we want to see that change.
So that that notion of the more titillating it is, and the more we can kind of wrap it up as we wrapped up 50 Shades of Grey, I guess, to make that saccharine sweet turd rolled in glitter style available to the masses. And while that's an element of the work, there are so many other elements of stories that just get eliminated because they're just not palatable for mainstream consumption.
Exactly. And I think especially in the United States, there is so much bogus rhetoric around trafficking, and preventing sex slavery, and FOSTA SESTA and the current Earn It Act are both these absolutely hysterical, hand-wringing, somebody please save all the trafficked children pieces of legislation, and they're super harmful to actual sex worker lives, and they do the exact opposite of what they intend to do. But they are absolutely a place where sex worker stories get mobilized against what we actually need, and that sort of thing is it's growing, and it has to stop.
So for people who are listening who may be not familiar with FOSTA SESTA and the Earn It Act, and how these things get conflated with trafficking, with children being forced into sex trade, slavery, and various other things like that, can you speak to ostensibly the truth around these myths, and really what this legislation was saying it was trying to stop, and actually the effect that it is having on sex workers, and where it's coming from and where it's gone wrong?
Sure. So FOSTA SESTA is a set of bills that was designed to fight online sex trafficking, quote unquote. And basically what that bill did was it enabled, it made platforms.
And this is an American legislation, but it had an effect internationally.
Exactly. Yep. And that really shows you, just how very global the reach of both American tech companies and the legislation that governs them, what a reach that has. Because, for sex workers in Australia, they lost, most or all of their income overnight due to some of this work. But, Right.
I mean, that happened across the world. So many sex workers who relied on online platforms to advertise their services were left penniless, literally overnight.
Right, and when you create desperation...
Because of this American legislation.
Yeah. And when you create scarcity and desperation, you create a very rife environment for exploitation to take place. So you can see the irony in some legislation that aimed to do the opposite. But basically, what it does is it makes platforms responsible for the content that their users post, and that creates this chilling effect. So if a platform feels as though it's going to be responsible for something, it's going to, of course, overstep and be very risk averse to try to censor that content before it goes online. And the result was that lots of advertising platforms that sex workers used were taken down, and lots of the digital spaces where we organize together or we share safety information, have peer-only space. Those were also under threat, and many of those have been lost. Effectively, the purpose of this legislation is to make it more difficult to access the places where the sex trade happens. Whilst the intended effect was to curb sex trafficking, what it actually does is curbs sex work, or makes sex work more difficult, which makes it more dangerous. And so...
Because the assumption being that nobody would willingly do sex work, they must be being coerced into it because it's such a disgusting job. Why would you do it if you weren't being coerced? Right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the assumptions that informs it. But I think it's also, if we call all sex work sex trafficking, we can do away with all sex work, and that is actually something that the U.S. government is invested in, eradicating sex work, which is absolutely impossible. Where there is need, there will be sex work, and we have known this for for all of human history,
literally forever.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like stating the obvious,
yes,
really.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the impact of that legislation that was passed in 2018 is still ongoing. There's another piece of legislation moving through Congress at the moment, which is which does even further damage to the protections that were held under Section 230, which Foster Sesta amends. So there's a
So that's Earn It,
Earn
right?
It, yeah.
The new one. Yeah.
I can't remember it. It's like eradicating. The acronym is fantastic. Like the reach that they go through to get a good acronym for these bills just blows my mind. But yeah, I think this, that it's a total erosion of, and this is what I was saying earlier, like when you criminalize our workplaces or our advertising platforms or whatever it is, you criminalize us. And so losing access to those platforms, and for many people, the low cost platforms tend to be the ones that they go for, and those are the platforms that end up getting shut down by legislation like Foster Sesta, and they're that means that lower income sex workers who can't afford to pay, $150 a month to advertise, they lose access to work. And what that does for them is that puts them either in situations where they need to work in another way, whether that's on the street or in a brothel, or any way that they would prefer not to work. And that's directly opposing to the well-being, the autonomy, the choice over how and where we work. And so that is a pretty big threat to sex workers across the globe.
It's an enormous threat. Not being able to choose, the locations that you work, the spaces that you work to a degree, the clients that you serve, and where you have no control over your safety and well-being, and even for clients that they have no control over their safety and well-being. It's just, the whole thing is just a mess.
Yeah. And that's...
And it's just because of this ongoing bullshit stigma that we want to try and, as you say, wipe out sex trafficking, sure, but wipe out sex work, and that then they're just not the same thing.
I often hear it referred to as like trying to perform brain surgery with a hatchet.
Right.
It's a very inappropriate solution for the problem.
Gala, Vanting, it is a delight always to be in your orbit, and I miss you terribly from the other side of the world. I can't believe that we're actually on the other side of the world from each other, and still fortunately able to connect with this fabulous technology. For folks listening, of course, all of Gala's information is going to be in the show notes, including links to follow Gala and Head House on the Instagram. Gala, I love you. I adore you. Thanks for taking time out of your breakfast and sharing your brekkie with me. It's always a delight. And keep on keeping on.
Right back at you. Thanks for inciting my journey into this whole mess anyway.
I couldn't think of anyone else I'd rather get messy with.
It's actually you. You're responsible for this. Any regrets?
Not even one.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you again.
I hope this conversation with Gala really showed you just how nuanced and how incredibly important it is that we understand more about how sex work intersects with the lives of everybody else, that this is not just some weird random thing that happens in isolation, that it intersects with, labor issues, with health and wellness, it intersects with feminism, it intersects with freedom, it intersects with relationships and personal labor. There's just so many ways that our understanding, or lack of understanding as it were, about sex work really impacts our communities as a whole. I really urge you to follow the links towards Gala Vanting and her work, including her work with the Scarlet Alliance. And again, of course, I'm always thrilled that you're here listening to The Erotic Philosopher. It's a pleasure making this podcast for you, and as a gesture of your enthusiasm, I would really love it if you would go ahead and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. In particular, rate and review us, letting others know that you listen, that you like it, and even more so why you like it, because that helps us boost our visibility to other listeners. If you're curious about what it's like to work with me, head on over to my website. That's cindydarnell.com, CyndyDarnell.com, where you'll also find the home of the Erotic Philosopher podcast under the podcast tab, giving you links to previous episodes as well as the form to send in your quandary for future philosophers to ponder. You'll also see ways to work with me, counseling, coaching and consulting for individuals, couples and groups, as well as my most recent clinical publications and of course my online classes, ready for you to take at home in the privacy of your own domain. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll join you next time.